It was a Sunday afternoon, like so many others. Or at least, that's what I believed as I stood in my kitchen in Surrey, waiting for the video call to connect. Outside, the late autumn light drifted lazily across the hedges, painting long amber lines across the tiled floor. I had opened the window earlier to let in the crisp air, the kind that carries both chill and comfort, but had closed it again when the kettle began to whistle. Now, the house hummed with that peculiar stillness that clings to empty rooms. I had made the effort. I always did, though I wasn't sure why anymore. I slipped on a clean blouse, brushed my hair until it shone silver under the lamplight, and switched on the good lamp near the dining table. My son James once said the lighting in this room made me look tired, and though it stung, I'd remembered. Even now, years later, I adjusted the bulb and angle to soften the shadows, to make myself appear less worn, less aged, less of a reminder that time spares no one. The laptop screen flickered, and with it, warmth bloomed across my chest. There they were, James, with that same crooked smile that belonged to his late father, and beside him, Charlotte, my daughter-in-law, polished as ever, her hair swept neatly back, her blouse crisp as though she'd stepped straight out of an office meeting. "Hi, Mum," James said cheerfully, giving a little wave. "Hello, darling," I replied, my smile stretching with an ease that surprised me. Charlotte leaned in, her lips curving into what one might generously call a smile. It never quite reached her eyes, though. Those eyes, cool and unreadable, had always carried a quiet reservation toward me. We exchanged pleasantries. I asked about the weather in London, about the new recipe I'd tried that week, about the groceries I'd picked up from the village market. James responded with enthusiasm, always eager to keep the conversation moving. Charlotte, on the other hand, added little more than polite nods, brief acknowledgments, just enough to remind me she was present. Still, I carried on. Pretending had become second nature. Pretending not to notice her restraint, pretending not to notice the subtle weight in the air each time she and I occupied the same screen. Halfway through, James's phone buzzed. He glanced at it and muttered something about a work call. "Back in a tick, Mum," he said, before disappearing off camera, leaving the laptop propped up on the kitchen table of their sleek, modern home. I stayed, sipping at the tea I'd brewed, quietly hopeful that perhaps Charlotte might open up with him gone. That maybe, without the buffer of my son, she might find it easier to bridge the gap between us. But instead, her voice came, sharp and low, as though she believed herself unheard. "I can't stand her," Charlotte muttered, the words slicing through the silence like glass against skin. My fingers froze around the warm porcelain of my cup. The edges of the screen showed only a sliver of her shadow as she paced just out of sight. "She just inserts herself like she owns everything," she continued, her voice rising with a disdain she'd never shown in front of me. "She's not coming back here. I don't care what James says." I didn't breathe. I didn't move. The clock in my dining room ticked far too loudly, each second pounding in my ears. And then, as though the knife she had driven into me needed one final twist, she added, "Honestly, it's like having a second mother, and not in a good way." Her words clung to the air like smoke, acrid and suffocating. When James returned a few minutes later, cheerful and oblivious, the mask slipped back onto her face as if nothing had been said. She perched beside him, nodded at his stories, and God help me, I smiled. I smiled and laughed at the right moments, and when we ended the call, I even said, "Love you both." My voice had never sounded so hollow in my own ears. That evening, as I cleared away the empty cup and folded the tea towel over the oven rail, my phone buzzed. A message from James. "Mum, please call before you visit. It's better this way. No punctuation, no warmth, no explanation." I read it once, twice, a third time, as though repetition might change its meaning, but it didn't. Each time the truth hit harder. I was not welcome in my son's home. Not welcome in the very place I had helped him build. The ache that settled in my chest was not anger. Anger I could have managed, even wielded. This was worse. This was recognition. A realization that somewhere, without my noticing, the ground had shifted beneath my feet. I sat by the window until long after nightfall, watching the faint glow of the street lamps against the mist. My reflection stared back from the glass. Lined face, tired eyes, lips pressed thin against words unsaid. How had it come to this? When had the woman who once asked me for recipes, who complimented my cooking, who thanked me with apparent sincerity, become the gatekeeper barring me from my own son's life? The questions clawed at me, but the silence of the house offered no answers. Only echoes. Echoes of laughter that used to fill these rooms when James was a boy. Echoes of Richard's deep voice reading the paper at the breakfast table. Echoes of a family that had once felt unbreakable. And now, just one message on a glowing screen had told me the truth. Somehow, somewhere, I had become an outsider. That night, I slept little. The walls felt closer than they had in years. The silence heavier. I lay awake, listening to the distant hum of traffic on the motorway, the occasional bark of a neighbor's dog, the creak of my old house settling into the cold. I wanted to believe it was a mistake, that James didn't mean it the way it sounded, that Charlotte had spoken in a moment of frustration, not cruelty. But even as I tried to convince myself, I knew better. Her words had carried a weight too deliberate, too raw to be dismissed as a slip. And James, my sweet, devoted James, he hadn't defended me. He hadn't even known what she'd said, and yet his message told me all I needed to know. He had chosen peace with her over honesty with me. I couldn't blame him, not entirely, but the fracture was there, hairline cracks running through the foundation of the bond I had spent a lifetime building. And I knew, with the certainty of a woman who had seen storms gather before, that this was only the beginning. The next morning, I moved through the house like a ghost. Every room carried memories. Every object whispered of sacrifices made, of love poured endlessly into a life that now seemed to be slipping through my fingers. The kettle hissed. I poured tea I barely tasted. My eyes lingered on the framed photograph of James at his graduation. The suit I'd bought him fitted perfectly, his smile wide and unburdened. I had stood at the back of that auditorium, clapping silently, unseen, unheard. I had always given without asking in return. That had been my rule, my way of loving. But now, for the first time, I felt the sharp edge of that silence, the cost of never asking, never reminding, never insisting. My sacrifices had become invisible, forgotten, and perhaps to Charlotte I had become unnecessary. But if she thought she could erase me from James's life as easily as deleting a name from a contact list, she was mistaken. I might have been silent, I might have been patient, but I had not been powerless. Not then, not now, not ever. And though she didn't know it yet, the woman who thought she could banish me had no idea whose shadow she was living under. When Richard died, the silence came quickly. It moved into the house, as though it had been waiting for its moment, seeping into the corners, filling the stairwell, lingering in the kitchen where his laughter used to rattle the window panes. I remember standing in the hallway the morning after the funeral, staring at his shoes by the door. They were polished, ready, waiting for feet that would never slide into them again. The house didn't feel like home without the sound of his voice, and yet it was mine to inhabit alone. James was just 21 then. He was in his final year at Cambridge, and though every fiber of me wanted to call him home, to let him stand beside me as I navigated the impossible, funeral arrangements, bank meetings, legal documents, I didn't. Stay, I told him on the phone, my voice steadier than I felt. Your father would want you to focus. You'll make him proud by finishing what you started. What I didn't say was this: I couldn't bear to see his young life collapse under the weight of grief. Mine already had. Better for one of us to keep moving forward. And so I buried my husband alone. I stood at the graveside while damp earth swallowed the coffin, my black gloves damp with soil and rain. The mourners offered their sympathy, their flowers, their quiet nods before drifting back to lives still intact. I stayed behind when they left, long after the last handful of dirt had been tossed, because leaving meant acknowledging that the world had shifted beyond repair. That was the first burial. The second came in the weeks that followed, when I began laying pieces of myself to rest, one sacrifice at a time. The company Richard and I had built together, Ellis and Harrow Construction, loomed over me like a cathedral of stone and paper. Contracts, invoices, supplier disputes. It was all there, demanding attention, where once I had played the partner behind the scenes, keeping books balanced and schedules precise. Now I was the only one left. The first months were brutal. I sat at the desk in the office Richard used to occupy, his chair still warm in my memory, and stared at numbers that refused to add up. The recession had bitten hard, and the projects we'd lined up were teetering on the edge of collapse. I came close, so close, to selling the beach house. I had listed it quietly, tested the market, even walked through its rooms one last time in my mind. But each time I pictured letting it go, I heard Richard's voice. Don't dismantle what we built, Maggie. Weather the storm. That's what we do. So instead, I cut from myself. I stopped buying little luxuries. First, the theater trips, then the meals out with friends, then the groceries trimmed down to bare necessities. There were nights I went to bed hungry, telling myself a slice of toast had been enough, because the money had to stretch further than seemed possible. James never knew. I didn't let him. His rent at Cambridge was paid on time, his tuition cleared, his needs covered without question. If it meant I wore the same coat 3 winters in a row, so be it. If it meant I skipped meals to keep the company afloat, so be it. Every check I wrote, every bill I settled, was a quiet promise to him. You will not be burdened by this. You will walk forward while I stand still. I can still see him at his graduation. The auditorium was filled with proud parents, the air thick with applause, and the rustle of programs. He wore a navy suit, tailored and sharp, the one I'd saved months for, pinching pennies until the money came together. He looked magnificent, taller somehow, older, like a man stepping into his own life. I stood at the back, half hidden behind a pillar, clapping softly as his name was called. He shook hands with men in gowns who had no idea how much it had cost, financially, emotionally, to get him there. I wanted to shout it, to tell the room that I had nearly broken myself to hold everything together for him, that I had traded comfort for survival, solitude for strength. But I stayed silent, because that was the rule I lived by. Never let him feel he owed me. Love, in its purest form, doesn't tally debts. So I smiled, clapped until my hands stung, and walked home through the drizzle, the suit bag crinkling in my hand where his old clothes were folded neatly inside. When James graduated, I gave him the down payment for his first flat in London. I remember his eyes widening, the way he protested, "Mum, I can't accept this." "You can," I told him firmly, pressing the keys into his palm. "And you will. Because your father and I built our lives for this, to give you your start." He hugged me then, fiercely, gratefully. He didn't know I had raided savings, taken out quiet loans, pulled strings at the bank. He didn't know I'd sat awake at 2 in the morning, running numbers over and over, whispering prayers that the ground wouldn't give way beneath me. All he saw was opportunity. All I gave him was stability, and that was enough for me. In those years, I became a master of silence, of carrying weight without letting it show. Friends would ask how I was coping, and I'd smile, nod, Tell them I was keeping busy. Busy. It became my armor, my excuse, my shield. I never let them see the nights I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, wondering if Richard would be proud of me, or disappointed that I hadn't asked for help. I never let James see the stacks of unpaid invoices, the creditors' letters I negotiated with trembling hands, the way my heart raced each time the phone rang with another demand for money. I was determined that his life would move forward, untouched by the collapse that had become mine. When he met Charlotte, I thought perhaps the tide was turning. She was articulate, ambitious, polished in a way that reminded me of the women in magazines. She asked me questions at dinner, complimented my shepherd's pie, laughed at the old stories James had heard a dozen times. For the first time in years, I felt lighter. Maybe, I thought, here was someone who would stand beside him the way I had stood beside Richard. Someone who could share the burden of loving him, supporting him. I believed she was genuine. I believed she was kind. And so I carried on. I kept giving, kept supporting, kept burying my own weariness so that James might thrive. Looking back now, I realize how invisible those years were, how easily sacrifices become shadows when no one is looking. The meals skipped, the sleepless nights, the house maintained alone, the company propped up in silence. I buried my husband. I buried my comfort. I buried myself. All so James could rise. And yet, sitting here, remembering the echo of Charlotte's words, I can't stand her. She's not coming back here. I wonder if perhaps I buried too much. If in my devotion I erased myself entirely. If by refusing to let him feel the weight of what I carried, I allowed others to believe there was nothing there at all. Because love, when offered gently, can disappear completely if no one cares to notice. And that, I was beginning to fear, was exactly what had happened. I can't quite say when it began. There was no single moment, no dramatic shift in tone that announced itself like a slammed door. It was subtler than that, like a draft creeping in through a cracked window, unnoticed until the whole house feels colder. At first, Charlotte was gracious. Or at least she performed graciousness well. She asked for recipes, complimented my cooking, even laughed at Richard's old jokes that I recycled through James. She seemed attentive, kind, a woman who might truly stand beside him the way I had once hoped. But kindness, I would come to learn, can be an act. And performance eventually slips. The first sign came during a dinner at their flat not long after they were married. We'd just finished eating, and I offered to help clear the plates. No, no, Charlotte said quickly, standing so swiftly her chair scraped against the floor. You're our guest. James, could you? She gestured toward him, as though the thought of me moving through her kitchen unsettled her. I sat back down, the warmth in my chest cooling. Of course, I said softly. It was nothing. Or at least that's what I told myself. But soon there were other nothings. It became the way she referred to me, always in the third person, even when I was present. James, did your mother say she was visiting this weekend? She instead of you. Your mother instead of Margaret. I had a name, but it was easier, I suppose, to remove me from the room even while I was sitting in it. At first, James didn't notice. Or maybe he did and chose not to comment. Either way, I pretended to. I smiled, laughed when prompted, folded myself smaller so as not to take up space that might already feel too crowded. The second Christmas after their wedding was when the absence began to take root. Just us this year, James said on the phone, his voice hesitant. Charlotte booked a retreat in Cornwall, some spa place. She thinks we need time to reset. Oh, I said, pressing the receiver tighter to my ear as though proximity might soften the blow. Of course. That sounds lovely. I'll see you soon though, Mom. But soon didn't come. I wrapped their gifts anyway, carefully, neatly, golden ribbon tied with precision, and posted them early. I imagined them sitting unopened beneath a tree I wasn't invited to decorate. Christmas morning, I made myself a small roast, laid the table for one, and watched the Queen's speech alone. When the phone rang, it was a perfunctory call. Cheerful enough, but brief, as though time was being rationed. "Thanks for the scarf, Mum," James said. "Fits perfectly." Charlotte chimed in from somewhere in the background, her voice half laughing, half distracted. "Yes, thank you for the wine." That was all. I set down the phone and stared at the empty chair across the table. Silence again was my companion. By the following Easter, even the phone calls themselves had begun to shrink. I would ring, leave a message about a new recipe or an article James might like. Days would pass with no reply. Then, eventually, a text would arrive, short and clipped. "Busy week. Call you soon." But soon rarely arrived. The house grew quieter with each passing month. My messages became small bottles tossed into an ocean, rarely returned, their contents unread. I began to dread the sound of my own ringtone, because each time it lit up and I saw his name, I knew the voice on the other end would sound thinner, further away, less my son, and more a polite stranger I was lucky to still reach at all. One afternoon, I decided I couldn't bear it any longer. I was in London for errands, and their flat was only a few streets away. I told myself I would simply drop by, just for a moment. Just long enough to hand over some soup I'd made, still warm in a flask. I knocked. Charlotte answered. Her smile was quick, sharp, and cold around the edges. "Oh," she said. Her body angled deliberately across the doorway, as if shielding the inside from my gaze. "You should have called." "I was nearby," I replied, lifting the flask as an offering. "Thought I'd bring James some soup. He always liked it when he was unwell." Her hand extended, fingers brushing mine only briefly as she took it. "He's resting," she said flatly. "Not feeling well, but thank you." The words sounded like dismissal. I stood there for a second too long, hoping she might step aside, invite me in, ask me to stay for just a cup of tea, but her body never moved from the threshold. So I smiled, thin and strained, and said, "Of course. I'll let you go." The door closed softly, politely, firmly. On the way back to the station, I held the empty space inside me like a wound. A week later, the phone rang. Not James. Charlotte. "Evelyn," she began. She rarely used my name. Her tone measured, rehearsed. "I hope you understand. You've been dropping by unannounced quite a lot, and James has been under so much stress. He really needs space." I pressed the receiver against my ear, words gathering but refusing to form. "Outside influences aren't healthy for us right now," she continued. Outside influences. I remember gripping the edge of the counter, my knuckles white. I had been reduced from mother to interference, from family to disturbance. I swallowed hard. "I understand," I said, though I didn't. Not really. "Good," she replied, her relief audible. "Thank you." She hung up. I stood there, listening to the deadline, the silence pressing into me like cement. James changed too. When I visited now, he no longer met my eyes easily. He looked down at the floor when I entered a room, his shoulders stiff, his laughter more cautious. When I asked him questions, he deferred, his gaze sliding toward Charlotte as though for permission. "Shall we open a bottle of wine, James?" I'd ask. He'd glance at her, then answer, "Maybe just tea tonight." Small things, but enough to notice. And on their walls, where photographs once showed holidays, childhood birthdays, family gatherings, my face had vanished. No framed photo of me and James on his first day at Cambridge. No smiling snapshot of us by the sea. It was as though my presence in his life had been carefully erased, replaced by curated images of their couplehood. I told myself not to push back. Not yet. Because if I pushed too hard, I might be accused of meddling, of overstepping. I didn't want to be that mother-in-law, the one who hovers, who intrudes, who refuses to let go. So I kept my silence, even as I felt myself being edged further and further outside the invisible boundary Charlotte had been drawing. But boundaries can be healthy, they say. Boundaries, when built fairly, protect love rather than suffocate it. This was not that. This was something else entirely. These were walls being built high, wide, and permanent. And whether he realized it or not, James was standing beside her, holding the cement. I had loved them both in good faith. I had given generously, offered gently, waited patiently. But love offered gently can disappear completely if no one cares to notice. And I could feel mine disappearing, reduced, diminished, quietly erased. One evening, after another short, clipped phone call, I sat at the table with my untouched tea and stared at the old photo albums stacked on the shelf. Each one told the story of a life I had given, a son I had raised, a family I had built. And yet, I was beginning to see with painful clarity. In the life James lived now, I was no longer written into the pages. I was an afterthought, an intrusion, an outside influence. And that knowledge hollowed me in a way even grief had not. Because losing Richard had been tragedy, but losing James, slowly, by inches, by silence, that was abandonment. And I wasn't sure which one hurt more. Charlotte liked to talk about her work as though it were a kingdom she was steadily conquering. At dinners, she would slip it into conversation with practiced ease, her voice laced with quiet pride. I had to rework the entire project budget myself, she'd say, sipping her wine. Upper management always leans on me when things get messy. They wouldn't know what to do without me. James would beam at her, admiration softening his features. He'd reach for her hand across the table, squeeze it gently, and I would smile too, nodding, pretending to share in his pride. But inside me, something tugged. Not suspicion exactly, but recognition, because every phrase she used, every achievement she boasted of, belonged to a world I knew intimately. The world of Ellis and Harrow, the construction firm Richard and I had built from scratch, brick by brick, contract by contract, through nights of exhaustion and mornings of doubt. She thought she was talking about her kingdom, but it was mine. When Richard died, the company could have collapsed. Many expected it to. Competitors circled like vultures, waiting for weakness, eager to poach clients or dismantle contracts. But I had not survived widowhood, hunger, and loneliness, only to hand over the one thing we had fought so hard to create. So I did something unusual. I disappeared. Not literally. I was still there every morning, still at the desk, still signing documents, and poring over numbers late into the night. But I removed my name from where it could be easily seen. I placed the company under a trust, installed David Turner, our accountant of 20 years, as the visible manager, and stepped behind the curtain. To the world, it looked as though I had retreated, a grieving widow unwilling to bear the burden of leadership. And in a way, that was true. But beneath the surface, every decision still ran through me. Every major contract, every vendor approval, every budget sign-off carried my unseen hand. I had learned quickly that wealth makes people eager, and visibility makes you a target. To protect both myself and the company, I became invisible. Years passed, and with invisibility came clarity. I saw people for who they were when they thought no one was watching. I saw which managers cut corners, which employees thrived, which ones merely posed. I watched patterns, tested loyalties, and discovered that silence often revealed more than confrontation ever could. And then came Charlotte, ambitious, polished, charming when it suited her, dismissive when it didn't. She had no idea whose shadow she stood in. To her, Ellis and Harrow was a ladder she had climbed by merit alone. She thought the company belonged to faceless executives, to shareholders, to men in suits whose names she barely registered. She never questioned the real foundation. She certainly didn't imagine that the woman she dismissed as an inconvenience, the mother-in-law she wanted barred from her own son's home, was the very woman who authorized her paychecks. At first, I let her play her part. There was a strange kind of fascination in it, watching her boast about late nights and crucial decisions, while knowing every budget she touched still required my approval. She moved her pawns with calculated confidence, and I stayed still, allowing her to believe she was winning. Because sometimes, letting someone reveal themselves is the surest path to truth. And reveal herself, she did. Her words grew sharper over time, edged with contempt for dead weight in the company, for old ways of doing things. She liked to cast herself as the modernizer, the reformer, the one dragging Ellis and Harrow into the future by sheer force of will. I let her talk. I smiled politely, but inside I was cataloging each phrase, each claim, each small crack in the mask she wore. I didn't need recognition. Not anymore. I'd already lived my life for applause that never came. I'd already watched James graduate, marry, build a life, all on the silent bedrock of sacrifices I had buried. What I needed was clarity. Clarity about who Charlotte really was. Clarity about whether James was blind or complicit. Clarity about how much further this distance between us could stretch before it finally snapped. So I waited. I let her climb higher. I let her decorate her little throne with ambition and vanity. I let her believe she had outmaneuvered me, shut me out, banished me to the role of irrelevant outside influence. Because when the time came to pull the ground out from under her, I wanted her to feel the full height of the fall. I remember one evening vividly. We were seated at their table, the three of us. James excused himself to take a phone call, leaving me and Charlotte alone for a brief moment. She leaned back, cradling her glass of wine, eyes gleaming with self-satisfaction. "I've been thinking," she said. "I could run this company myself one day. Not just my department, the whole thing. I already know which clients trust me. It's just a matter of time." I tilted my head, studying her face. "Ambition looks good on you," I replied softly. She took it as a compliment, but inside, I marked it as a confession. That night, when I returned home, I unlocked the safe in my study and pulled out the thick folder that held the trust documents. The ownership records, the signatures, the contracts all bore my name. Not hers, not James's, not anyone else's. The truth sat heavy in my hands, a truth Charlotte was utterly blind to. It would have been easy to tell her. One sentence, and the world she thought she controlled would tilt beneath her feet. But I didn't, because timing, I had learned, was everything. If I revealed it too soon, she would twist it, argue, claim bias. She would tell James I was interfering, grasping for relevance. No, I needed more than revelation. I needed evidence. I needed her mask to crack on its own, for her own words and actions to condemn her before anyone else ever had to. So I locked the documents away again, and I waited. Invisibility, after all, is a weapon. People underestimate what they cannot see. And Charlotte, with her polished smile and careful posturing, had made the fatal mistake of underestimating me. But waiting came at a cost. Each day, the rift between James and me widened. Each unreturned call, each politely clipped message, each celebration I spent alone became another stone in the wall between us. I told myself I was being patient for his sake, for his protection, that exposing Charlotte too soon would only drive him further into her arms. But late at night, as I sat in the silent house, I wondered, was I protecting him? Or was I simply afraid of what the truth might demand once it was spoken aloud? Because truth, once revealed, cannot be undone. Still, I knew one thing with absolute certainty. Charlotte Reed was building her life on a foundation I had laid with my own blood and bone. And one day soon, that foundation would shift. When it did, she would finally see me, not as the woman she dismissed, not as the second mother she never wanted, but as the force she had never imagined I could be. The question was no longer whether I would reveal it. It was when. And when that moment came, I wouldn't whisper. I wouldn't beg. I wouldn't ask to be let in. I would take back what had always been mine. When clarity became unbearable to ignore, I called David Turner. It was early morning, the kind of pale gray dawn that paints everything in subdued tones. I stood by the window, phone in hand, watching the mist roll across the garden. My voice was steady when I spoke, though inside, the weight of what I was about to begin pressed heavily against my ribs. "David," I said, "I need you to look into someone, quietly." There was a pause on the line, but not hesitation. David had been with Ellis and Harrow for over 20 years. He'd known Richard, known me, known the long nights and hard bargains that had built our company. He was one of the few who had seen me hold everything together after Richard's death, and one of the even fewer who knew the truth, that behind the curtain I still pulled the strings. "Give me a name," he replied. "Charlotte Reed." Another pause, longer this time. Then, simply, "Give me a week." He didn't need a week. 4 days later, we met in my sunroom. The morning light stretched across the table. Falling on the thick folder, he slid toward me. Its weight alone made my hands ache. "She's smart," David said, as he adjusted his glasses, his expression grave, but not careful. I opened the folder, and with each page, the woman my son had married began to unravel. The first section contained purchase orders. At a glance, they seemed routine. Supplies, materials, equipment. But David had highlighted discrepancies in yellow, each line item inflated far above market rates. "Vendors no one's heard of," he explained. "Shell companies, most of them less than 2 years old. No history, no track record. Rates inflated by 40, sometimes 50%. My stomach tightened as I flipped the pages. Every fraudulent contract felt like a personal betrayal, not just of me, but of the company Richard and I had built with sweat and sacrifice. The next section was worse. Expense reports. Lavish dinners marked as client meetings. Weekends in Aspen and Napa Valley disguised as industry conferences. Receipts for hotel suites, spa treatments, and imported wine tastings, all billed under company expenses. "She schedules them over bank holidays," David noted, tapping the page. "Convenient. Looks legitimate at a glance, but the pattern is clear." I stared at the neat columns of numbers, each one a nail in the coffin of any illusion I had left about Charlotte's integrity. And then came the digital trail. David had printed screenshots from her professional profile, curated posts filled with self-congratulation and ambition. "Taking bigger swings this quarter," one caption read beneath a photo of her at a conference I had never approved travel for. She stood smiling beside executives from a rival firm, tagged proudly as though building her next kingdom in plain sight. Another post. "Some of us don't wait to be chosen. We build our own ladders." I could almost hear her voice saying it, sharp, self-satisfied, certain that the world owed her recognition. David slid another document across. This came anonymously, an email she sent to a contact at that same rival firm. "Listen to this. With the right connections and leverage, I'll be in charge sooner than people expect." The words seared themselves into me. Not ambition, not confidence, calculation. She wasn't just posturing, she was maneuvering. And she was using my company, my money, to do it. I closed the folder slowly, pressing my palm flat against its cover, as though to contain the venom inside. David watched me carefully. "What do you want to do?" I didn't answer right away. Rage flared in me, hot and immediate. But it wasn't rage that would guide me. This wasn't a battle to be won by shouting. "No confrontation," I said at last. My voice was quiet, but the decision behind it was iron. Not yet. Not until everything is complete. I want every detail, every misstep, every piece of evidence that leaves no room for denial. David nodded once. I'll keep digging. That night, I sat at my desk with the folder open. The papers spread before me like pieces of a mask falling away. Each document, each receipt, each boastful caption was another glimpse into who Charlotte truly was beneath the polish. The same woman who had told me I was disruptive, unwelcome, an outside influence, had no hesitation siphoning money from the company that paid for her marble countertops and fine wine. I had spent years giving without asking in return, years burying my own comfort so James could rise. And here she was, carving indulgence out of my sacrifice, mocking me in the same breath. It wasn't just arrogance. It wasn't even just fraud. It was theft of trust, of position, of family. And I had spent too many years building both to let someone like her dismantle them unchecked. I began to watch her more closely, not in person, but from the shadows I had always occupied. At meetings, she spoke with confidence, wielding jargon and figures like weapons. James looked at her with admiration, and I forced myself to smile, even as I heard the hollow ring beneath her words. At dinners, she dropped hints about her long hours and constant demands, painting herself as the martyr of the company. I nodded politely, though I knew the truth, that her hours were padded with indulgence, her demands disguised theft. Each time I said nothing, because silence, I had learned, is not always weakness. Sometimes it is strategy. I created a burner account online, following her professional updates under a false name. The curated image she presented to the world was sharp, ambitious, unstoppable. But ambition without integrity is a tower built on sand. And sand, given time, always shifts. The more she posted, the clearer her pattern became. She wasn't simply trying to rise within Ellis and Harrow. She was preparing to leave, to take clients with her, to position herself as a competitor, to use the very foundation I had built as the launchpad for her own empire. She thought she was clever. She thought no one was watching. But I was. I always had been. In the evenings, after the house fell quiet, I sat with the folder open and traced her trajectory like lines on a map. Each page was a step she had taken, each document a footprint leading her closer to betrayal. I began to imagine the moment of reckoning, the look on her face when she realized whose shadow she had been living in, whose company she had stolen from, whose patience she had mistaken for weakness. But it wasn't satisfaction I sought. Not entirely. It was justice. Justice for Richard, who had poured his life into Ellis and Harrow. Justice for myself, who had sacrificed quietly for years. Justice for James, blind though he was, who deserved to know the truth of the woman he had bound his life to. When I closed the folder for the final time that night, I felt a calm settle over me. I knew now exactly what she was playing at, and I knew exactly how to play her back. The investigation had ended, but the game, our game, was only just beginning. It had been more than a decade since I last walked the halls of Ellis and Harrow as anything more than a shadow on a document. The faces were younger now, fresh suits, sharper shoes, eyes bright with ambition. Yet the bones of the place remained unchanged. The corridors still smelled faintly of polished wood and printer ink, the hum of voices carrying the same rhythm of urgency I remembered from long ago. Except now, no one knew who I really was. David had arranged everything with his usual precision. A brief internal memo announced my return under the vague title of Strategic Advisor from the Ownership Trust. No further explanation. No clear role. Just enough formality to keep people curious and enough ambiguity to keep Charlotte unsteady. I liked ambiguity. It unsettled people more than outright power ever could. I began quietly, one-on-one conversations with department leads. gentle requests for updated project pipelines, cost analysis reports, vendor audits. I asked questions that sounded harmless. How do you find the supplier rates? Or, how are deadlines affecting team morale? But every answer sharpened the picture I was painting. I didn't rush. I never had. Patience had kept me alive this long, and patience would unravel Charlotte's mask thread by thread. She didn't notice me at first. Why would she? To her, I was just another advisor parachuted in from some faceless trust. An observer, not a player. Harmless, forgettable. That was exactly what I wanted her to think. When the day finally came for our scheduled meeting, the atmosphere shifted. I was waiting in the conference room, papers neatly stacked before me, when the door opened, and there she was, Charlotte Reed. All polish and posture, every line of her tailored blazer sharp enough to cut, nails manicured to perfection, hair sleek and deliberate. Her smile was pleasant, too pleasant, the kind worn by people who believe themselves unassailable. "Margaret," she said warmly, extending her hand as though we were old friends. "We finally meet in person." Her tone was light, practiced, but her eyes flickered with curiosity. She wanted to know what role I really played, what I was here for. I took her hand. It was warm, but stiff, controlled. "Nice to put a face to the emails," I said. We sat across from each other, the table a battlefield disguised as mahogany. "I hear you've been sitting in on some of the operations meetings," she said, her smile still perfectly in place as she flipped open her tablet. "Just trying to understand the rhythm of things," I replied, folding my hands calmly. "Get a clearer picture of how the pieces move." A small nod. "Well, I'm happy to walk you through my current portfolio. I'm managing 5 projects, 3 of which are in final stage development." And then she was off. She spoke in a torrent of numbers, deadlines, timelines, client relationships. She liked holding the floor, liked the sound of her own competence. Every statistic was delivered like a trophy, every achievement framed as indispensable. I let her talk. I listened, nodding occasionally, jotting a note here and there. Silence is a powerful tool. People rush to fill it. And Charlotte was no exception. The more I gave her space, the more she filled it with carefully curated self-praise. "You must be stretched thin," I said gently when she paused for breath. She gave a half smile, her eyes bright. "It's a challenge, but I thrive under pressure." I leaned in slightly, tilting my head as though considering something. "Have you ever thought about starting your own firm?" For the first time, her composure wavered. Just a flicker. Her eyes sharpened, calculating. "Actually, yes," she admitted, voice casual, but her pulse visible at her throat. "I've been toying with the idea. I've built strong client relationships here. I know which accounts would follow me. The only thing missing is the right opening." I smiled slowly. "Ambition looks good on you." Her face lit faintly, taking it as a compliment, not realizing she had just handed me a confession. The meeting continued, pleasantries layered over subtext. She spoke of efficiency. I heard exploitation. She spoke of opportunity. I heard preparation for betrayal. She spoke of loyalty. I saw self-interest gleaming behind her eyes. By the end, she believed she had impressed me. She rose from her seat with the poise of a victor, extended her hand once more, and said, "I look forward to working closely with you, Margaret." I shook her hand, steady and calm. "As do I." She left the room thinking she had gained an ally. I left the room knowing she had just revealed her strategy. Later, alone in my office, I laid out my notes. Charlotte's empire was fragile, propped up by stolen funds and hollow charm. She believed herself untouchable, but every empire built on theft eventually collapses under its own weight. And when it did, I intended to be standing right where she least expected, not as an outsider, not as an inconvenience, but as the force that pulled the rug out from beneath her. But even as I planned, I couldn't help but think of James. Did he see it? Did he notice the arrogance, the manipulation, the slow way she cut me out of his life? Or had he convinced himself, as so many men do, that silence was safer than truth? I wanted to believe he would see her clearly one day, that he would understand why I had stayed quiet, why I had watched from the shadows instead of stepping into the light. But hope, I had learned, is dangerous. And so I put the thought away, returning my focus to the papers before me, to the war I was waging quietly, carefully, piece by piece. The polished smile had cracked, if only for a moment. That was enough, because a crack, given time, always spreads. The boardroom had never felt so still. Sunlight filtered through the tall windows, laying long stripes of gold across the polished oak table. Around it sat the senior staff of Ellis and Harrow, department heads, project leads, legal counsel, faces drawn and expectant. Papers shuffled quietly, throats cleared, but beneath the surface there was tension, a current that hummed through the air. At the far end of the table, David Turner sat with his folders lined neatly before him, his expression calm but alert. Beside him, a space had been left for me. I walked in slowly, deliberately, heels striking against the floor with quiet authority. Conversations hushed as I took my seat at the head of the table. My presence was no longer ambiguous, no longer background. Today, there would be no shadows. "Thank you all for coming," I said, my voice steady but low. "We won't take much of your time, but there are matters we must address, matters that strike at the very core of this company." The room leaned in. I opened the first folder and slid it across the table, the paper whispering against wood. "Here," I began, "are records of payments authorized to a vendor called Hartwell Logistics, a supplier with no physical office, no tax ID history prior to last year, and pricing that exceeds standard market rates by more than 40%. A ripple of murmurs broke out. I watched heads bend as the papers passed from hand to hand, brows furrowing as the figures spoke for themselves. Before anyone could settle, I opened a second folder. "And here," I continued, "is the purchase of a private condominium in Lakego, listed under the name of a consulting firm created 3 months ago. That firm's invoices appear here." I tapped the document sharply. "As billable project expenses." The rustle of paper grew louder, tension building like storm clouds gathering. Finally, I opened the third folder. "These," I said, sliding the documents into the center, "are vendor registration forms signed with a name not legally authorized to act on behalf of Ellis and Harrow." I looked up and met her eyes. Charlotte sat halfway down the table, her posture rigid, but her expression smooth. For a moment she didn't flinch. Her jaw was set, her smile polite, as though she were listening to a lecture she already had an answer for. When she finally spoke, her voice was even, measured. "These are serious allegations," she said. "I assume your attorneys will be hearing from mine." The words were calm, but her knuckles whitened against the tablet she held. I turned to her fully. "You used my company, my name, and you lied to my son." The room stilled. Silence thickened, heavy as stone. James, seated just left of center, blinked rapidly, his face paling. "Mum." His voice was quiet, uncertain. "What is this?" I looked at him, not unkindly, but with the weight of truth. "It's the truth," I said. "All of it. And I waited for you to see it on your own." But I ran out of time. Charlotte straightened in her chair, her mask slipping only slightly. "This is personal," she snapped. "You're retaliating because of family issues. You don't have the authority to make these accusations." I rose from my seat, my palms flat on the table, leaning forward with quiet force. "I do," I said, my voice low but carrying. "I always have." A murmur swept through the room, sharp intakes of breath, the shift of chairs against the floor. Charlotte froze. "You work for me, Charlotte." The words rang out, clear and undeniable. And now, you don't. No one moved. There was no shouting, no chaos, just breath held taut, eyes wide, silence thicker than any sound could be. And in that silence, her polished mask began to crack. Her lips trembled, just faintly. Her gaze darted once, toward James, then away. Her shoulders stiffened, as though sheer will alone could hold her upright. But the weight of the evidence was crushing, and she knew it. David cleared his throat softly, sliding another folder forward. "The supporting documentation has already been filed," he said. "Our legal team will handle the resignation process and the report for financial misconduct." The matter was closed, not by debate, not by argument, but by inevitability. Charlotte left the company in silence. No lawsuit, no grand statement, no fiery exit. Just a resignation letter passed through legal, her name stripped from projects she once bragged about as though they were her crowning achievements. The empire she had tried to build on stolen stone collapsed overnight, and she had no choice but to walk away from the ruins. But for James, it wasn't that simple. I remember the look on his face in that boardroom, the way his world seemed to tilt beneath him, the confusion, the betrayal, the dawning horror that the wife he'd trusted had been building her empire on lies, and that his mother had been watching it all unfold from the shadows. That night, he came to me, not with anger, not even with questions I could easily answer, just with the hollow look of a man who had lost more than he could name. "You've been funding my life," he said quietly, "watching everything, and I never knew." I poured him coffee, set the cup in front of him, though he didn't touch it. "You knew what you needed to," I replied gently. "I didn't want your love to feel like a transaction." He shook his head slowly. "But why didn't you tell me who you really were?" I met his eyes. "Because I was hoping you'd see who she really was first." He said nothing for a long time, just stared into the dark coffee he wouldn't drink. And then, finally, he stood. "I need space," he murmured, voice hollow. He left with a suitcase weeks later, moving into a small flat across the river. No explanation, just silence. And so, victory tasted nothing like triumph. Yes, the truth had been laid bare. Yes, Charlotte had fallen. Yes, the company remained intact. Justice served. But my son, my only son, had fractured beneath the weight of it all. And I couldn't tell if I had saved him or lost him. Sometimes, when I sit in the quiet of my house and think back to that boardroom, I wonder if I chose the right battlefield. I won the war against her. But in doing so, perhaps I opened a war within him, and silence, once again, was all that remained. Charlotte's absence was quiet. No fiery exits, no public scandals, no accusations hurled across newsprint. One day her name was on projects, and the next it was erased, her resignation letter folded neatly into a legal file. She vanished as though she had never been there at all. The company continued, its engines humming as though nothing had happened. Contracts were honored, meetings resumed, deadlines pressed on. In the rhythm of business, people are replaced quickly. Memory fades faster than stone can crumble. But at home, the silence was heavier. James stayed in their flat for a while after she left, moving through rooms that had been decorated by her hand, surrounded by echoes of a life already collapsing. I didn't call. He didn't come. We lingered in parallel, like two planets drifting in different orbits, connected by gravity yet never crossing paths. Weeks later, a message appeared on my phone. "I'm moving into a place across the river. Just for a while. I need space. No punctuation, no warmth, no explanation." I stared at it for a long time, the words glowing on the screen, and realized they carried the same emptiness as the message Charlotte had once sent me. "Please call before you visit. It's better this way." The symmetry was almost cruel. The morning he left, he came by early, before the sun had risen fully. The kitchen light was soft, pale, the kind that makes old rooms look like memories instead of spaces. He looked thinner, older. His eyes carried shadows I hadn't seen before. "I don't know what to feel," he said simply, standing awkwardly near the counter. "You've been funding my life, watching everything, and I never knew." I poured coffee into 2 cups, set one in front of him. "You knew what you needed to," I told him gently. "I didn't want your love to feel like a transaction." He didn't touch the cup. "But why didn't you tell me?" His voice cracked slightly, quiet but raw. "Why didn't you tell me who you really were?" I met his gaze. "Because I was hoping you'd see who she really was first." He nodded slowly, as though he had expected that answer, and hated it anyway. A silence stretched between us, fragile and unbreakable all at once. And then he left. No hug, no anger, just a man carrying the weight of everything that had come undone. After that, the house felt even quieter. I told myself I had done it to protect him, and that was true, mostly. But in the stillness that followed, I found myself admitting the rest. I had wanted her to feel it. Not just the consequences, not just the exposure, but the shame, the humiliation of being caught by someone she thought irrelevant. I wanted her to know exactly who had pulled the ground out from under her, and I didn't regret it. Not for a moment. James began rebuilding slowly. I heard through David that he had started therapy. He joined a community garden project near his new flat, something small and grounding. He sent me short messages every so often, check-ins, updates, polite and neutral. "Planted tomatoes today. Works fine. Busy week. Hope you're well." We hadn't had a real conversation in months. The words between us now were like cracked porcelain, still holding but fragile, with hairline fractures that might never close. Sometimes at night, I sit by the window and watch the street lamps glow against the mist, the garden beyond sinking into shadow. I think about the choices I made, the silence I kept, the truth I wielded like a blade when the time came. Did I save him from a life built on deceit? Or did I simply take away his right to discover it on his own? When does protection become control? When does silence turn into manipulation? I don't know anymore. There are days I replay that boardroom scene in my head. The way her face froze when I told her, "You work for me, and now you don't." The way the silence fell heavy. The way her mask cracked in front of everyone. It should have satisfied me. It did, in the moment. But satisfaction is fleeting. What lingers is James's face, pale and bewildered, caught between the truth of his wife's betrayal and the truth of his mother's deception. I wanted him to see clearly. I wanted him to know I had been there all along, holding the world steady beneath his feet. But clarity comes at a cost, and I fear the price may have been him. The garden outside grows wilder now. Weeds curl along the edges of the path. Ivy stretches higher up the stone wall. I should tend to it, I know. But some days, it feels right to let it be untamed, to let it mirror the cracks and overgrowth I can no longer control inside myself. Because not everything can be pruned back into order. Some fractures never close. Some silences never break. Some distances can't be crossed, no matter how much love built the bridge to begin with. Still, there are moments. When James's messages appear, brief though they are, I cling to them like lifelines. Proof that he hasn't vanished completely, that there is still a thread between us, however frayed. I reply simply, kindly, never pushing, never prying. Because I've learned that pushing only widens the cracks. And if silence is all I am left with, then I will learn to live inside it. Sometimes, late at night, when the house is utterly still, I hear Richard's voice in my mind, calm, steady, teasing me for the battles I've fought and the ones I've chosen. "You've always been the strong one, Maggie," he used to say. But strength can break things as easily as it holds them. And I wonder if that's what I've done. Held too tightly, protected too fiercely, broken what I was trying so desperately to save. Victory is a strange thing. From the outside, it looks clean. Charlotte gone. The company safe. The truth revealed. But inside, victory leaves scars. Hairline fractures invisible to others, but jagged and raw to the ones who bear them. I won, and yet I lost. And perhaps that is the truest definition of family, that even in triumph, there are cracks that no amount of justice can mend.